For point of personal privilege.
Senator has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today about a week late to acknowledge the birthday of General Robert E. Lee, and I do so because of scheduling issues and out of deference to other members who wanted to speak to the floor. But nonetheless, on Friday, January the 19th, it was Lee's 211th birthday. And Mr. President, today there are some Americans that are challenging long-held traditions and images as irrelevant or offensive. And it is convenient today to ascribe 21st century morals and understanding to people of earlier eras when they don't exactly fit the purpose of our narrative today. And sometimes heroes seem to be made and destroyed by how they fit the latest popular or political agenda, and not by their substance and contributions to an American fabric. Lee was such an American hero, and his legacy has fallen victim to just such a contemporary rewriting of history. Mr. President, Robert E. Lee and his fellow Virginians did not go to war to preserve slavery. Virginia's secession convention voted twice against secession until Abraham Lincoln called on states to send men to form a force to march across Virginia to invade the seceded states. Lee was asked to lead that invasion. And then and only then did Virginia choose the route of secession. And with that, Robert E. Lee resigned his commission and returned to Arlington as a civilian. Because, as he wrote, I've not been able to make up my mind to raise my hand against my relatives, my children, and my home. To those of us in the 21st century, we may not understand that someone would identify themselves more as a Virginian than as an American. But prior to 1861, most residents of the United States thought of themselves as New Yorkers, Ohioans, Carolinians, or Virginians more than Americans. There are also Northerners, Westerners, and Southerners, and they define stark cultural, economic, and political differences. And these loyalties dramatically outweighed many national values. Lee, whose life had been formed by the lives, struggles, and dreams of his father and his hero, George Washington, revered the United States as their singular greatest accomplishment. And he dedicated his life to serve that dream as they had. But like his father and George Washington, his understanding of the United States began and ended in their identification as a Virginian. Lee wrote to his son Rooney that I shall return to my native state and share the miseries of the people. Save in her defense, I will draw my sword no more. He hated the idea of secession and disunion and understood that it would lead to war, but his honor would not allow him to abandon his home and his family in a time of disaster. When the time came, he accepted the governor of Virginia's call to lead her defenses. Virginia's future would be placed in the hands of the man that General Winfield Scott called the very finest soldier I've ever seen. Lee saw slavery as an evil, but like so many in his day, he didn't know what to do about it, except in that in which he could control for the future. Before he was assigned to combat duty in Mexico, he wrote out his will that slaves that he had inherited from his mother's estate should be freed upon his death. Again, when his father-in-law died in 1858, one of his duties was to free the slaves of his father-in-law. Lee saw the Confederate nation as much more than a slaveocracy and proposed that slaves be given freedom for serving in the Confederate Army, with assurance that their families would be granted manumission. This would have led to an eventual abolition of slavery in the South. He saw that the political tenor of the war had turned from a fight to reunite the country to a fight to abolish slavery. He made every effort to encourage the Confederate political leadership to embrace the inevitable and began the transition of enslaved people from bondage to freedom, but the Confederate Congress would not agree. In his darkest hour, Lee placed his country and his people before his own glory, legacy, or reputation. Faced with insurmountable odds and the inevitability of a defeat, he accepted the magnanimous terms of surrender and rejected the futility and chaos of guerrilla warfare to save countless lives, homes, and ultimately a nation. Upon his surrender, he signed the oath of allegiance and began to lead his country, Virginia and the South, in healing the wounds of a broken people and a reunification of a nation redefined by war and a new national identity. Upon his return to civilian life, General Lee was offered lucrative commercial opportunities to use his name for profit and celebrity. All of these he rejected. Instead, he spent the last 5 years of his life preparing young men to be leaders of the reunited country. In the modest life of the president of an impoverished college, he explained that, "I've led young men in battle. I will now teach them to be citizens." At his death, Lee was recognized by friend and foe alike as the epitome of American manhood, virtue, integrity, and sacrifice. He was measured by what one is willing to give for the cause of his convictions, his country, even at great cost or peril. The New York Times, which had vilified Lee in life, wrote in their report of his death, "Not long after his surrender, he was invited to become president of Washington College at Lexington, Virginia. Since that time, he has devoted himself to the interest of that institution, keeping so far as possible aloof from public notice, and by his unobtrusive modesty and purity of life has won the respect of even those who most bitterly deplored and reprobate his course in the rebellion." And Mr. President, I would leave you with a story about a Sunday in St. Paul's Episcopal Church here in Richmond in June 1865, where the folks had gathered to worship, and they had much to pray about and to thank God that the war was over and ask God to help in the days of healing to come. When the Reverend invited the congregants forward to receive the Eucharist, a tall, well-dressed black gentleman proceeded down the center aisle and knelt at the rail. For a moment, nobody moved in the church, and even the rector appeared to be stunned. And then it was General Lee who rose from his pew, processed to the rail, knelt beside that black gentleman, and indicated for the preacher to proceed with serving the elements. With that, the rest of the congregation got up, came down to receive the sacraments. Mr. President, it would seem to me that we should judge people on the whole of their lives and not just a small part of it. When we adjourn today, I would ask that we adjourn in memory of General Robert E. Lee.
Thank you, Senator. Is there other business to come before the Senate? Seeing none, the clerk will read announcements on